Okay, welcome everybody to our 231st Studying Online Sports Economics seminar. We have today Alex Farnell from Maynooth University in Ireland presenting the case for the defence, co-worker effects on pay in the NFL. Alex is quite happy taking questions as he goes along, and so please do that, and you're welcome to interrupt him, or if you raise your hand and I can interrupt him. Either way, we can make it work. That's all from me, Alex. All over to you.
That's great. Thanks very much, James. So I'm just going to get the slides open. So I will leave them small screen for the moment because I'm going to jump out of them in a second. But if there's a problem with sharing, just let me know. So yeah, thanks again, James, for the invitation to speak. It's always good to come back and speak in Roses. This is some work with Rob Simmons, who can't make it here today because he's flying back from France, and Dave Berry, who said he would be on the line at some point. And we're looking at what we're calling co-worker effects, which might sound a little bit like peer effects, but we're hesitating to call what we find peer effects because we don't think what we're finding are peer effects. That might sound like a distinction without a difference for the time being, but as I go through, hopefully I will explain that difference. Okay. So just by way of motivation, what I'm going to do is just switch screens, and I'm hoping this YouTube video that I loaded up earlier will come through. And I'm going to show you a clip from the NFL. I promised Dave Berry that I would show a clip from the Detroit Lions because that's his favorite team. And I want you to, just as I show you this clip, it's only going to be a couple of seconds long. I just want you to think about who's the most important player on this play. So I'll make that big screen so it's a bit easier to see. And I'll just play this.
Alex, you've muted yourself.
Muted myself. Okay. Is that better? Am I back on?
Yep, can hear you
okay.
now, yeah.
Okay. So the question I kind of asked at the start there, if I get the screen back up, okay, was this one here. So who's the most important player in that play? And I suppose to some extent the commentary gave away the answer. What kind of I would expect most people to say is, well, clearly the most important person in that play was the running back, right? They were the one who were very athletic and dodging tackles, avoiding tackles, and so on. But of course, it's not that simple. Okay, the running back wouldn't have been in a position to make that play had it not been for, first of all, the center has to pick up the ball, the center has to give the ball to the quarterback. Those things are kind of routine, but then after that, it's down to the offensive line to try and make holes for the running back to try and get through the play. And really, without the offensive line doing their job, it would be very difficult for the running back to do that. Okay. Equally, of course, if the offensive line did their job and maybe the running back didn't quite understand what was going on in that play and they ran down the wrong gap, then that play wouldn't have worked in the same way. Okay. So it's a very kind of fluid situation that I just showed you. And what we have put in it a little bit more technically is, of course, we have a setting where we have team production. So each member of the team is presumably responsible for at least some part of the output, but identifying each individual player's contribution to the output is potentially quite difficult. Okay. Now, I think in economics, we're generally quite content in saying that these social spillovers more broadly do exist. Okay, and they've been identified across a wide range of settings. Probably most common would be education. So, for example, if we have a very good student, they are probably more likely to hang around with very other good students, and that might increase their performance in tests, for example. Okay, but we also see it coming through in the legal system. We see it coming through in health decisions and decisions to engage in kind of risky behavior. We see it in crime. Okay, so these peer effects, as we might call them, are generally very wide-ranging. Okay, now a couple of years ago, Josh Angrist wrote a paper and said, "Okay, that's great. We find these peer effects," but he urged caution in saying that these things definitely are peer effects. Okay, and there's a really nice example to illustrate that by Mas and Moretti, where they looked at a case study of supermarket checkout workers, and what they found was that if you have kind of a very inexperienced supermarket checkout worker, and then a more experienced supermarket checkout worker comes and sits in the checkout row alongside them, then the productivity of the supermarket checkout, the inexperienced supermarket checkout worker actually increases. So in that case, it's hard to pinpoint that that is a peer effect. It's difficult to say that the productivity of those two workers are linked. However, there are theories of peer effects that say a peer effect could be because of kind of social pressure. So it could be something to do with you're feeling the pressure to perform if someone else comes and works alongside you, and you feel as though you have to kind of conform to those. That works much the same way in education, for example. So if you're a good student and you see your peers are also studying really hard, then it might incentivize you to also study really hard because you don't want to miss out on a good grade as well. Okay. So that could improve performance, but it could also detract from performance if you do feel the pressure and that kind of gets in the way of your performance. So that's one strand of peer effects. It's this effort and motivation story. There's another possibility which is about learning. So this is particularly relevant if there are complementarities across different workers. It might be that you gain information about how to do a task from watching your peers. Okay. What we suggest in this paper, however, is that we think something else is going on. We're not discounting these first two stories, particularly the learning effect, as we'll show, but we also think that something else is going on in the background as well. Okay. Now, of course, trying to identify these peer effects empirically is generally problematic. It's generally quite difficult because, of course, peers aren't randomly chosen. Okay, so if we think about education, good students tend to select into peer groups that are also generally quite well able. And so if we do see them doing well on this test, for example, it's quite difficult to separate out whether it's just the ability component or whether it's the peer effect that is helping them get those good grades. So in the education literature, there has been some attempt to tease out these peer effects, and what they do is they look for some case of random assignment, which is usually looking at random assignment of roommates. So generally what happens is when you put your college application in, or when you put your accommodation preferences in, you can kind of say, okay, I don't want to share with someone who maybe is a smoker, or I don't want to share with someone who listens to loud music. But after that, the assignment of your roommates is generally random. Okay. But even then, the peer effect, the evidence is not that clear. So sometimes it matters for some outcomes, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it matters for females, but not for males. The third one I've got listed there does find a pretty substantial peer effect, and this is in the US Air Force Academy. Now, perhaps we shouldn't be too surprised that something is being found in the US Air Force Academy, because there is going to be an emphasis in that type of setting for peer effects. So your peers, the rest of your squadron, is going to be very, very important to you. You work with them, you eat with them, you kind of sleep in the same dorms as you. So there is a big emphasis on peer effects there. And so perhaps it's not surprising that we see peer effects emerging in that case. In sports, we've also had some things to say about peer effects. So Persona a couple of years ago looked at the NBA, and they looked at players who left the NBA to go and compete at the Olympic Games. When they're playing at the Olympic Games, they're playing both with and against other elite players. And what Persona finds is that when they then go back to play in the NBA, compared to a group of similar players based on some propensity score matching algorithm, the players who went away to play at the Olympic Games is about 7% higher than the similar players who stayed at the NBA. There's a little bit of evidence from golf as well. So Gurian et al. In 2009, golf tournaments have this really nice feature that you're randomly assigned playing partners. So I think it's groups of 3 in golf tournaments. But they found that there's no effect on your own score of being paired with a better player. But as a follow-up to that, a couple of years ago in Economic Inquiry, Hickman and Metz kind of took that argument a little bit further, and they looked at one specific aspect of golf, which is putting, and they were able to use the shot-by-shot data from these professional golf tournaments, and of course, sometimes you're going to be the first player who puts on the green, sometimes you're going to be the second player who puts on the green. And so there is a potential to learn from your peers by watching them how they putt on the green. So by watching them putt, you can get a sense of how fast the ball is going, how the green is behaving, are there any slopes that are difficult to see with the naked eye. And what they find is that there is a process of learning by the peers. So by going second or third, that has a positive impact on your own putting performance. However, there's a negative relationship between player performance and the quality of shots by their previous peers. So that's this psychological effect. If you're following someone who puts in a really good shot, then that actually has the possibility to detract away from your performance. Okay. Now, all those papers that I've shown you have focused on performance as an outcome. And I think that makes sense because that's how we generally understand peer effects. We're normally thinking about spillovers in productivity. But of course, there is a possibility that if somebody else's work makes my work better, then that also has a potential to improve my own salary. There isn't generally as much attention on salary as an outcome. There are 2 papers that we're aware of that focus on salary. And both of these papers have require pretty substantial, the words escaped me, admin data. Okay, so this first one here looks at all workers from the city of Munich. This second one looks at all workers in the private sector from the region of Veneto, which is in the north of Italy. And these papers both find some modest effects of working with better peers on your own salary. Okay. So what we do in this paper is we kind of follow these and look at the effects of teammate productivity on individual salary. We're going to be looking at the NFL, and in particular, we're going to be looking at the NFL defense. And the story is that because in the NFL, and I'll go into this in a little bit more detail in a second, but in the NFL, it turns out to be very difficult to separate out the individual productivity from what the rest of your teammates are doing. Okay, so there is a potential that working with better teammates affects your own performance, and that could then feed through to your salary. But in these settings where it's difficult to identify which player is doing the work in this setting where we've got team production, it could also be affecting management's impressions of how workers are doing. And so as a result, managers might confuse that individual performance with how the rest of that group is doing. Okay. Now, I'm going to be kind of open and upfront with this, despite me talking about the education literature that goes to kind of identify these peer effects using some random assignment. We don't go down that route. So we don't have any fancy identification strategy, despite us kind of looking for some, we don't have one. But hopefully, as I go through, I'll convince you that we are finding something even in spite of this non-random assignment of peers to peers. Okay, so we're going to be looking at the NFL defense. If you're listening from North America, I apologize. This next 5 minutes is going to be pretty basic, but I want to make sure that we're all happy with the NFL defense and what the role of the NFL defense is to do. So primarily the aim of the defense is to stop the offense. Okay, so the offense has to move the ball down the field The field is 100 yards long, and the offense wants to get the ball in a position where they can score points. So they can try and go for a touchdown, which gives you 6 points plus another 1 if you get the conversion, or you might get into a position where you can score a field goal. So the aim of the defense is to stop the offense, get in the yards, where they get into a position to score the points. Now, the offense can progress the ball down the field either by passing or by running. So the defense can try and stop the run, and they can try and stop the pass as well. Okay. So that would be directly stopping runs. That would be things like covering receivers to make it difficult for the quarterback to put it into the arms of an open receiver. Sometimes the quarterback can run as well, so you're going to have to be aware of stopping the quarterback running. Even if there is a run downfield, then the defense still has to be as disruptive as possible because there's still a possibility that they could cause fumbles. So anything that's there to disrupt the progression of the offense down the field is what the defense is trying to do. Okay, so this is how a typical NFL defense would set up. The defensive team here is this team in white. I'm guessing that's the San Francisco 49ers by the look of the uniform. And then the offensive team is this team in green here, and that looks like it's the Green Bay Packers. So the defense, as it's structured here, this isn't always the case, but normally this is how the defense would look, is that we've got these 4 guys up front here. So we've got the defensive ends and we've got the defensive tackles. Together, they're the defensive line. And then behind these, we've got the linebackers. So we've got the outside linebackers and we've got the middle linebackers there. Now, together, these front 7 players are going to be called our defensive front. Okay. And then behind those, we've got these 4 guys here. So we've got the 2 cornerbacks and we've got the safeties. I just saw a hand go up there. I don't know if there's a question, or maybe it was a legacy hand. No, a hand just popped up in the corner of my screen, but maybe it was a legacy hand or something. Okay. So let's go back to big screen. Okay. And then we've got these 4 guys here. These are going to be our defensive backs. Now, each of these kind of position groups has a very specific role, and it really depends on whether the offense decides to run the ball or whether they decide to pass the ball down the field. So let's start off with a case where the offense decides to run the ball. If they decide to run the ball, then the aim of these front 4 guys is primarily to stop the run. Okay. If they can't directly stop the run, then what they want to do is make kind of a channel available or make a route available for their linebackers to come through and stop the run as kind of the secondary line of defense. Okay. If the offense tries to pass the ball, then the aim of these front 4 and these linebackers is to try and get to the quarterback before they throw the ball. So that would be something called pass rushing. Okay. Now, failing their ability to directly get to the quarterback is then going to be looking for perhaps this guy, these receivers to try and throw the ball to. Okay, and that's where these cornerbacks and these safeties come into play, because their aim on a passing play is to try and cover these open receivers. Okay, so there's going to be a lot of complementarities and a lot of intricacies going on here. Okay, because if we have a passing play, okay, so the quarterback has got the ball in the hands, the aim of these defensive, particularly the defensive ends, is going to be to get to the quarterback. Okay, now if they do that quickly, that's going to make the job for the quarterbacks and the safeties a lot easier, because it means they're not going to be covering these receivers for as long. Okay. Now, equally, if the cornerbacks and the safeties are doing a really good job of covering their receivers, the quarterback's going to be there with the ball in their hands for longer, and that's going to make it easier for the defensive line to actually get to the quarterback. Okay, so there are lots of intricacies, lots of complementarities going across these two position groups. One thing I should say is that we're not going to distinguish in our models between the defensive ends and the defensive tackles, and the outside and the middle linebackers, and the cornerbacks and the safeties. So we're just going to group all of these together as our front 7, or as our defensive front, and we're going to group these 4 guys together at the back as our defensive backs. Okay. So that's just a summary of what I've just said. Their primary goals, if you're the defensive line, are going to be pass rushing and run defense. Defensive backs have got to do pass coverage, a little bit of run defense if the running back manages to get through. The linebackers are interesting because the linebackers are kind of a hybrid group. Okay, so they are partly responsible for rushing the passer. They're going to be partly responsible for stopping the run if the defensive line maybe doesn't do their job initially. And if it's a pass play, then they're also going to be engaged in some coverage as well. So they're a bit of a hybrid group, and they've got bits of both roles to do. Okay. So the key thing that should be coming through here, right, is that the actions of one group is going to very much depend on the actions of the other group, and that happens both ways. Okay, so the story I said a little bit earlier, if the defensive line is really good at getting to the quarterback, that makes the secondary's job a lot easier, okay, because they don't have to cover for as long, okay. So in terms of what these defensive players do and how it relates to their salary, because this is going to be our outcome. It turns out from sports econ literature, we really don't know much about the pay of these defensive players, or at least what leads to the pay of the defensive players. If we were looking at offense, the story would be very different because we know a lot more about what goes into the salaries of the offensive players. And you can see the names that come up here, Rob and Dave. You know, they've done a lot of work on this, looking at quarterbacks and running backs. Someone else has done some stuff on wide receivers. But the thing is that we know a lot about the salary of offensive players. We really don't know much about the salaries of defensive players. And I think there's a very good reason for that. And the reason is because it's very, very difficult to gauge what a defensive player actually does. Okay, so the obvious thing to do would be to look at something like sacks. So that would be where, for example, the defensive line, if we go back to my picture here, that would be where the defensive lineman managed to get to the quarterback behind the line of scrimmage and they managed to get them to the ground. That would be a sack. Okay, we could also look at interceptions. That would be, for example, where this quarterback here, you know, intercepts a pass. So before it gets to the receiver, they catch a ball, and that would be an interception. Those would be tempting things to look at, but they're generally quite rare events, which means that they're going to be quite noisy. And that's really only a part of what the defense actually does. Okay, so really what a defense does not do is also going to be very, very important. So I mentioned this idea about coverage. Trying to measure the defender's ability to cover this receiver if they don't get an interception is going to be very, very difficult. Okay. But of course, if this cornerback here, for example, at the top is very, very good at covering this receiver, then that means that the quarterback isn't going to look this receiver's way because they're not going to be open. Okay. So if the quarterbacks are really good at doing their job, then it means they're potentially less likely to get interceptions because the quarterback isn't necessarily looking their way. Okay. So one guy that summarized this story up really well is Pat Surtain. So I think many people would regard him as being the best quarterback in the league. He plays for the Denver Broncos. But if you look at his stats from the 2025 season, they're fairly modest. So he only got one interception. Okay, there was from memory one guy who got 7, a couple of guys who got 6. But he only got 1. Okay, so, you know, given he's widely considered as being one of the best, he only got 1 interception. But if you dig a little bit deeper into his stats, he was actually only targeted 61 times over the course of this season, which, given he played most of the games and he played most of the snaps in these games, is a pretty modest number of times he was targeted. And the pass completion percentage of the quarterback when they targeted the receiver that was next to Pat Surtain was only 54%. Okay, and if you look at other players kind of in this same region of the number of times they were targeted, that 54% is pretty small. Okay. So with that in mind, given the difficulty of assessing what these defenders do, we turn to use these grades produced by Pro Football Focus. And the really nice thing about these grades is that analysts will look at every single play and they will look at every single player on every play and they will give them a grade for their defensive actions. Okay. The way that the grading system works from memory is that for each play, they start off with a score of 0. If they are doing good things, which could include interceptions, the obvious things like interceptions and like sacks, that would give them good scores, but also things like staying in good coverage would give them positive scores. And I think the maximum score they can get is a +2 on each play. If they do bad things, so for example, missing a tackle, this thing called blown coverage, which is where there's a receiver that's completely wide open. If they give away penalties, then they get points taken away from them. And I think you go down to -2. Okay. So the really nice thing about these grades is that they capture a lot more than just the conventional statistics. The slight disadvantage is that we don't know everything that goes into it, although they do a pretty good job of summarizing most of the things that go into this. Okay, this is then regularized across all the players in a particular season, and they're given a score between 0 and 100 over the course of the season. Okay. The nice thing is here is that there is plenty of variation to bite on. Okay, so it's not like interceptions or sacks that are pretty rare events. They tend to be quite lumpy in where they appear. Here we have a really good range of the ratings across the players, and there is plenty of variation there. Okay. If we just look at the players who over our sample period are the top performers, it kind of passes the smell test. Okay, so Aaron Donald comes out as #1, and actually he kind of dominates the top 10. Other names in there: Myles Garrett, J.J. Watt, Nick Bosa, Micah Parsons. They're the kind of the names that we would expect to be ranked as the top players. Okay, so just as a very kind of simple test, they seem to be matching up as to who we as fans would understand as being good defenders. Okay, now as well as the overall grades, we also have kind of access to slightly more granular grades, which are basically measuring how well they do at these particular skill sets. So we know how well these players do at pass rushing. That's basically how good they are at rushing the quarterback, how good they are at disrupting the quarterback, getting to them quickly. We know how good they are at run defense. Okay, so this is based on successful tackles, the number of times they can hit the running back as close to the line of scrimmage as possible. If they force a fumble, then that gives them a really, really good score on these grades. And we also know how well they do in coverage. So this is covering these receivers and how good they are at covering their receivers. Okay. Okay, so then how do we kind of use these to measure particularly teammate performance? Obviously, each individual player is going to have a set of grades. They're going to have an overall set of defensive grades, plus coverage grades, run grades, and so on. But we're also interested in how your teammates do. Okay, so I've put kind of a very basic visualization together here. So we've got two groups of players. We've got these green guys here, and we've got these orange guys here. Now each of these is going to have an individual performance metric, but we're also interested in, if I'm this player here, A1, I'm interested in how do the rest of my players in my same position group do. Okay, and also if I'm this player here, B1, how do the rest of my players in that same position group do? Okay, so we kind of follow the standard here, okay, which is where we leave that player out and we calculate the average of the performance of the other players in that position group. And in particular, we take the weighted average. So here we're weighting by snap counts. We don't want there to be a case where we have one player who comes in just for 1 or 2 snaps, does really well, and that kind of artificially just inflates how well they do. So we're weighting their performance by the snap counts, okay? And we do this for every player in each of these position groups. But there's also a possibility where player A1 is going to be affected by how well the players in the other position group do. Okay, and so for here, player A1, they're also going to be attributing a grade to the weighted average of players B1, B2, and B3. Okay, and again, this is the weighted average based on snap counts. Okay, so we've got 2 ways of assessing teammate performance. We've got how the rest of your position group do at your own position, and then we've got how the rest of the other position do as well. Okay. So they're the performance grades. We're going to, for the salary measure, we're going to use the salary cap hit, okay, which is now kind of the preferred way of measuring salary for the studies on North American sports. Importantly, it's not necessarily the money the player actually earns in a particular season, and that's because players sign a signing bonus, which is kind of prorated over the course of the contract, plus they might get a little bit each year. But this salary cap hit is basically the amount of money it would cost to cut the player in a particular year. So you can kind of think about it as being the marginal cost of holding that particular player. Okay, and this comes from a website called Over the Cap. Okay, so for the salary model, we are going to be looking exclusively at non-rookie players. So this is players who have reached free agency. We don't want to be looking at the salary of rookie players because their contract is determined by the collective bargaining agreement. So we're looking at players who've reached free agency because it resembles a little bit more of a competitive market. Not completely, of course, but we're also going to be focusing exclusively on players who are in the first year of their new contract. Okay, and the reason we do this is because the standard way of specifying the salary model is that you look the salary of a particular player in a particular year, and you use their performance in the previous year in year T-1. Okay, so that really only makes sense then, therefore, to look at the first year of a new contract. Okay. So we're going to be regressing the log of the cap hit. We've got a couple of time invariant player controls in there, which is basically where the player was drafted. We also know how many years the player has played in the league, whether they were selected for the Pro Bowl, which is kind of like this all-star game, proxies maybe for star quality, maybe it proxies for some other things like leadership as well. And we also include a dummy variable for whether or not the player changed team. We know snap counts. We also include interceptions and sack counts in there. The idea is that potentially these grades don't capture everything, and there might be some explanatory power left over for things like interceptions and sack counts. And then the things we're going to be interested in are these Pro Football Focus grades. So we're going to have your own grades, we're going to have your proximal teammate grades, and we're also going to have your distant teammate grades in there as well. Okay. Okay, so let's get on to some descriptives. You can see we've got a fair amount of player churn here. So 54% of players change team at the end of their contract. Obviously, the remainder are going to be renewing with the same team. 16% are selected for the Pro Bowl. We've got about 12% drafted in the first round, and so on. Okay. And then on the right-hand side here, we can see the grades. Okay. And we're going to be splitting up for the defensive front and for the defensive backs. Okay, so I'm going to get into some results. And first of all, I just want to show you the control variables. These are going to be in all the models, but just to avoid having really big tables, I'm just going to get the control variables out the way first of all. So as I said, separate estimation on the defensive front and defensive backs. So the more you play, the more you get paid. So the more important you are to the team, the more you get paid. Experience enters with the usual increasing but decreasing relationship, and we get a turning point of between 6 and 7 years, which sounds kind of reasonable. Interestingly, draft round is still important. So even though we're looking at a sample of free agent players who presumably by this time the league has had enough information to see how they actually perform, the draft round still holds some importance. Okay, so a premium still for being a first round draft pick, a salary penalty for the defensive front if you're undrafted. Pro Bowl selection, as we'd expect, is strong and significant. And change team is negative, and this is usually what we find in studies of North American salaries. If you change team, you experience a salary penalty. And the usual argument that's given here is that this is a signaling argument. Okay, so the team, if they've released you, they're basically saying there's a player out there who we think is better, and as a result, we tend to see that players who change teams get a salary penalty. Okay. Interestingly, even with these Pro Football Focus grades, which we've argued do a better job of capturing performance than just sacks and interceptions, sacks and interceptions are still important. Okay, so even though we think that the Pro Football Focus grades are good, they clearly don't kind of mop up everything about player performance. All right, so let's get into talking about the salary model and looking at the player performance. So what the first coefficient in each case tells us, and this makes sense, is that the better you do as an individual player, the more you get paid. Okay, that's true for both the defensive front and the defensive backs. Moving down, we then have the average of the grades from your proximal teammates. So how the rest of the defensive front does on average contributes positively to the defensive front salary, and how the rest of the defensive backs do contributes positively to the performance of the defensive backs. Okay. When we go down to the bottom, the last coefficient is looking at the other position grade, so kind of the distant position grade. So for the defensive front, this would be how your defensive backs do, and we can see that that is not entering with any significance. And then down here, we've got how the defensive front does and how that affects the salary of the defensive backs. And we can see that that does lead to a salary increase for the defensive backs. What we then do is we can kind of split these grades up and we can see, are they being driven by anything in particular? Well, individually, pass rushing matters, run defense matters for defensive front, run defense and coverage grades matter for the defensive backs. It's the coverage grades that matter for the own position teammate grades. Okay. And the one that I think is kind of most telling is down here at the bottom right. It's the pass rush ability of the defensive front that matters for the defensive backs. Okay. And I think that's quite telling, because what this is, I think, telling us is that if we have a defensive front that's really, really good at getting to the quarterback, really, really good at disrupting their rhythm, getting to them before they throw, then this, of course, means that the defensive backs don't have to cover their receivers for as long. Okay, and potentially that looks as though it's offering a salary premium for these defensive backs. Okay, so just kind of keep these results in mind, because I want to expand on these and discuss these a little bit more. The sum from that is that own grades matter, which is good. Proximal teammate grades matter. And I think even in that, there's something interesting that potentially team executives are finding it difficult to distinguish between a single good player or just a player being part of a very good unit. But the performance from the other group of player positions is not necessarily symmetric. Okay. So I want to discuss this in a little bit more detail, because of course what could be going on is that I'm working with alongside a very, very good player. Maybe that just helps me improve my own game. Okay, so perhaps there is not just a salary spillover, but also a productivity spillover as well. So that's what we explore next. And this is for the defensive front. So here we're regressing the defensive grades of the individual player on the average grades of their proximal teammates and the average grades of their kind of distant teammates. Okay. And what we can see is that your proximal teammate grades do not affect your own grades. So it's not as though there's necessarily a productivity spillover from one defensive front player to another. But remember, that was showing up positive and significant in our salary model. Okay, that was this coefficient here. But it's not necessarily being driven by a productivity spillover. The performance, however, of the defensive backs is showing up in helping your own defensive grade as a defensive front. And I think what this is telling us is that if you have a defensive back who's really, really good, basically at covering the receivers, then as a defensive front player, that allows you to get to the quarterback much, much quicker. Okay, but if we go back to the salary model, that's this coefficient here. I hope you can see the mouse. That wasn't showing up as being significant. Okay, so what we're kind of getting at here is that management are potentially finding it very, very difficult to separate out who are the good individual players and who are the good players or who are the players just being part of a better overall defensive group. Okay, that was the defensive front. If we move on to the defensive backs, we've got kind of fairly weak evidence, only significant at 10% here, that the grades of the defensive backs are being affected by their fellow defensive backs. So not really much evidence of a spillover. But there is, again, if we go across different teammate positions. So the performance of the defensive front is associated with increased performance of the defensive backs at the individual level. Okay, and if you remember this coefficient here, okay, if we go back to the salary model, that was showing up there as being significant. Okay. So there are some spillovers, but it is being driven mainly by the performance of the other group. And I think what this is pointing to is this interplay between the defensive backs and the defensive front. Okay, clearly no defensive back is going to be able to cover receivers forever. So that means that these defensive backs really need the defensive front to disrupt the quarterback quickly. Otherwise, it's going to make the defensive backs look bad when they have kind of wide open receivers and they have blown coverage. But on the converse of that, obviously a defensive back, if the defensive front is never getting to the quarterback, if the defensive back is always letting these receivers free, then the defensive front is never going to get to the quarterback, okay? And that's going to make the defensive front look bad, okay? Now, of course, all of this is against the backdrop that your teammates are not necessarily randomly allocated to you, okay? Of course, it's a little bit different to the education story where you're selecting into your own peer groups. It's not like teammates are choosing their peers. Obviously, their peers are kind of being chosen for you here. But I think in terms of how that's going to affect the models, that could potentially work in either way. So I can see a case where a team might say, okay, we're really strong in this position here, in which case we can possibly get away with spending less on the other position groups because we're kind of compensated for by this really strong player in this particular position. And that might be the case with the salary cap in place, of course, which we have in the NFL. But I can also see a case where the team says, we're really strong in this position, so let's make sure that we're going to be a really defensive football team. We're going to be really strong on defense. So I'm going to make sure that this defense is kind of stacked with talent, in which case we have good teammates being partnered with really good teammates elsewhere as well. So I think a priori that possible bias could work either way. Now, just to delve a little bit deeper into the story, we do one or two things with the models. And the first thing we do is we're going to split the sample into players who move teams and players who stay with the same teams. And I think this is potentially quite informative because if you've got a player from your team and you're looking to sign them up again, well, you probably have much better information about how that player is actually performing. Not only do you see them on the pitch, but you also see them in training. You kind of get to know how studious they are, how committed they are. So beyond just that knowledge about how they do on the pitch, you get a real good sense of what kind of player they are. Whereas if you're looking at a player from another team, maybe the information that you're getting is potentially a little bit noisier because you're not seeing them every day on kind of the training pitch. So what we might conjecture from that is that if you're hiring a player from another team, you might just be looking at how that player does as part of a unit of defensive players, in which case we might expect that the performance of their teammates becomes much more important rather than if you're kind of rehiring the player from the same team, where presumably you don't need that extra information about how that player is performing as part of the group. Okay, and indeed that's exactly what we see happening. So we've got defensive front, defensive backs, splitting those up into movers and stayers. Reassuringly, your own grades are important regardless of if you move or stay, but we can see for defensive front players, the performance of your fellow defensive front players matters only if you're moving team. Okay, it's insignificant if you're staying on the same team. And the same is true for defensive backs. The performance of your other defensive backs is important if you decide to move teams, but it's not important if you're staying with the same team. Okay. The other thing that we do that is potentially useful is we look at the non-normality of this salary cap hit. Of course, this is not going to be an issue for OLS because none of the, obviously none of the desirable features of OLS require the outcome variable to be normally distributed. But it's going to be interesting to look at how the effects of the covariates differ along the distribution of salary. Okay, so we're going to use unconditional quantile regression. And this is potentially going to be interesting because at the lower end of the salary distribution, we're going to have lots of players who are essentially easily to substitute for one another. Okay, so one player might go to another team, one player might be injured. Because they're not necessarily superstars, it's going to be easier to just bring in another guy and they're going to do essentially the same job. That might not be the case right at the top end of the salary distribution, where you kind of have the superstars and it becomes much more difficult to replace that superstar with someone else who's going to do an equivalent job for you. Okay, this is how the cap hit is distributed, as you'd expect. It's got a really, really long right tail. So, we've got the majority of players who are earning, I was going to say fairly low wages. Low is obviously relative, fairly modest wages, shall we say. But we've got obviously some players right at the top of the distribution. Aaron Donald is the highest earner, and he had a cap hit of 27 million. Okay, so we've got a really, really long right tail. Now, if we run this with the unconditional quantile regression, right throughout the salary distribution, your own grades matter. Okay, and generally they're more important at the top of the distribution than they are at the bottom. But what's interesting here is looking at the performance grades of your proximal teammates, and you can see that that matters at and below the median quantiles. Okay, so for the defensive front players, it's fairly substitutable players that are driving the salary of other fairly substitutable players. That's not true at the top. And for defensive backs, the same story is true there. Okay. Okay. The last kind of check I want to show you is just a sensitivity check. Hopefully with those kind of two last checks, movers and stayers, and the quantile regression, we've gone some way to convince you that maybe there's something there. But even they are not addressing this random assignment of teammates to teammates, okay? And even beyond that, there might be other things going on, okay? So it might be that we have a team who has a really good coaching setup. They have a really good defensive coordinator, for example. That's not something that we're capturing necessarily in the model. And again, that could be another source of possible bias in the results. So to address these, we're going to use this sensitivity check called SenseMaker. And what SenseMaker basically asks is how strong does unobserved confounding need to be? So either an omitted variable or a group of omitted variables. How strong do they need to be to overturn a research conclusion? Basically to drive this coefficient of interest down to 0. Okay. Or at the very least down to a range where it's statistically indistinguishable from 0. Okay. And what it suggests doing is it says, okay, pick your strongest observed coefficient, which in our case is this probol variable here. Okay, and it says, okay, if we had an unobserved confounder or a group of unobserved confounders that were as strong as this effect from probol, or twice as strong, or 10 times as strong, what would that do to your coefficient of interest, which in this case is going to be our teammate grades, so our proximal and our distant teammate grades. Okay, and what it does is it gives you some pictures like this. So along the axes, we've got kind of the two measures that we need for unobserved confounding to be a problem. So we've got the relationship between the unobserved variable and the treatment. Treatment here basically means variable of interest, which is going to be the coefficient on your teammates' grades. And we've also got the relationship between the confounder and the outcome. And then depending on the different strengths of those relationships, these kind of contours here tell us what the coefficient on, in this case, the proximal teammates' grades would be. Okay. So our unadjusted coefficient from our model That was this 0.017. And then it says, okay, if you include this confounder that is as strong as your strongest included variable, your coefficient would change to 0.02. If you included something that was twice as strong, 3 times as strong, and you can see here, even when we're including something that's 10 times as strong as the probol variable, we're still seeing something that is this side of 0. Okay. If we move to the graph on the right, that's the same story, but instead of looking at the coefficient, it's looking at the t-statistic. And even with a variable that's 10 times as strong as probol, we're getting something with a t-statistic of 2.77. Okay, so still significant at conventional levels. So this is for the top row is for your proximal teammates, the bottom kind of 2 graphs are for your distant teammates, and we can see that both of these are robust to something that is 10 times as strong as probol. For the defensive front, it's not quite as strong, but we've still got a result that's robust to, if we look at the t-statistic, something that's robust to about twice as strong as the probol coefficient here. Okay. Okay, so that pretty much brings me to the end. I think the important messages are that we do have productivity spillovers, but they don't necessarily translate into salary effects. And where they do, they're not necessarily symmetric. Okay. Now, of course, the real story is a lot more complicated because we've got issues of wage setting and bargaining mechanisms. So kind of to unpack all these, we'd need a much kind of fuller investigation. In terms of things we could do or things we have done but have had little success doing them, we have tried to directly address this non-random assignment of peers. And our approach was that we tried to use injuries as an instrument for peer quality, right? So presumably injuries are exogenous. So the idea is that if a player is injured, the quality of your peers might decrease. But the kind of the first stages here weren't necessarily strong enough to use that as an IV. Possibly because we're using seasonal averages, and so over the course of a season, maybe an injury doesn't have that much of an effect, or maybe injuries aren't exogenous at all. Okay, so if you're playing with really, really poor peers, so if you have a defensive back who's really, really bad at covering, for example, then maybe because the defensive front has to constantly chase the quarterback, maybe it does expose them to more injuries. So maybe injuries aren't exogenous. I don't know, but either way, the test didn't work. It could also be that we could do a similar analysis for offense, because I think a very similar story exists for the offense. If we take the relationship between the quarterback and the wide receiver, how do we know whether it's the quarterback putting the wide receiver in a really, really good position with their throw, or is it the wide receiver that's really good at getting separation? And then does that show up in the wide receiver salary? Does it show up in the quarterback salary, or is there some kind of spillover into both of their salaries? Okay. But that's it from my end. I'm happy to take any questions that come my way.
Thank you very much, Alex. I'm going to send you a team run. Whoops. And we've got time for questions and comments. So if anyone does have any, please do raise your hands and we can get going. I should say that Rob is here despite being flying back. So I don't know if
Rob got back from France. Very good.
Joined from mid-air or something. Georgi.
Hi, yes. Thank you very much for the presentation, Alex. This was great. The only thing I have is really more like splitting hairs, one might say, but there are some formations which you might deliberately want to exclude. For instance, to take the offense by surprise, sometimes the people that you assigned into the category of that second line, like safeties, they blitz. So like there are formations that utilize safety blitz. So maybe those plays you just exclude for, you know, a very clear separation of the duties. And sometimes, you know, again, this doesn't happen often, but someone you would put in front of the line would drop back for coverage, especially on plays that, you know, you absolutely need to protect yardage. So, I mean, the point is, it's probably not going to change your results much, but I would personally love to see if it does at all, and you know, so that for the clarity, you just exclude those plays. So that's my only comment. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks, Hugh. Yeah, I agree. I mean, if I think if we had play by play, then yeah, of course, that makes the story a lot more complicated and intricate. Given we're using kind of seasonal averages here, I mean, we're just taking the position that Pro Football Reference gives us as their main position. Whether it has more detailed breakdowns about how often they line up close to the line of scrimmage or not, I don't know. It might do, but yeah, I mean, I agree. If we had more granular data, game by game, season, play by play, then yeah, I can see the point. Yeah, definitely.
Jeremy.
Alex, thank you for the presentation. I'm wondering, so if I remember your unconditional quantile results correctly, you saw the results heavily for kind of the lower salaried players, correct?
Yeah,
Is there,
at and below the median, yeah.
yeah, below the median. Is there something to be said about role in all of this? In that a player on the defensive line, and not just specifically position, but their relative role compared to the other members of the defensive line. Are they, if there's a star player on the line, the player in question might have a particular responsibility on the line that's systematically different than the star player, right? And then productivity might be the way we think about returns to salary. Then if we take just a Pro Football Reference grade, right? The returns of an additional grade point might not be equivalent depending on the particular role that you have, right? Is there, do you think there's anything to that? Is there, especially because you're seeing these heterogeneous effects, right? So is there something to be said about returns for these metrics based on the role you might have either in the secondary, where I think that's even more so true, right? Because if you're in the secondary, you're a defensive back, you know, if you're the primary guy, you might serve, like, if you might be a coverage guy for their number one, right? Versus, hey, your job is to catch the slot guy, and how we might perceive performance relative productivity's effect on on salary might differ depending on the particular type of role you have, irrespective of the grade.
So if I'm understanding the question right, and possibly I'm not, but so you might be putting your star defensive end on more rush assignments. Is that what you're saying?
Potentially, but the idea is that your second best rusher or your third best rusher might have a systematically different responsibility on the play. Yes, everyone's goal is to go after the quarterback, but in the terms of way plays are drawn up, that's not always the primary responsibility. One defensive end's job might be to essentially stunt the offensive lineman, get them out of position such that the better defensive end is able to rush the quarterback.
To actually get out of them.
Right. So player role, even within similar positional groups, might be different. And I wonder how that affects productivity measures, right, in terms of how PFF is capturing it, but then also return to productivity in terms of return on salary.
That's a good point. I mean, from my understanding of the Pro Football Focus grades, it's trying to be, I suppose, as individualistic as possible. So if you have a clear run at the quarterback, then that doesn't give you a higher, or that doesn't give you as high a grade as it would be if you had to beat an offensive lineman to get there. I suppose a lot of the intricacy would be ironed out by the fact that we're using averages across the season. It is. It is a nice point, though. I'm not 100% sure how to think about it, but I think it is a nice point.
Great. Thanks, Jeremy. More questions and comments? I was going to ask you, this will betray my lack of understanding of what you've done and also NFL. But if I understand, are you looking at essentially effects at the same time, essentially? So current salary, current peer effects, essentially.
So this is current salary based on T-1 performance. But
Okay, so
for
it's
the
last one season.
for the yeah, exactly, yeah. So yeah,
So
kind of standard, yeah.
No. But all I wondered was whether there might be a longer time lag for an impact. You know, when you've played with a great defensive partner a few years ago, and it's really showed an effect on your trajectory after that.
So there's a longer learning effect possibly than just quite possibly. I mean, the contracts are quite dynamic. You know, a lot of the players are signing 1-year contracts all the time, or they're renewing. I mean, there's obviously a portion who do sign longer contracts. Yeah, I mean, I mean, it's just the standard way to specify the salary model, right? Just T and T-1. But yeah, there is possibly a longer learning effect. I agree. Yeah.
And I guess we're kind of relatedly, I don't know, maybe I missed it, but do you split the potential impact by player age? Yeah, so there's more of a stronger effect for a younger player, more impressionable, versus an older, more experienced player, something like that.
We don't. I mean, we have experience as a control, but we could do. Yeah, yeah. There could be a way to. I mean, above and below median experience or something. So, do you pick up more from your teammates in the early stages of your career? Possibly. Yeah, we could delve into kind of heterogeneity by experience. Possibly. That's a nice point. I was thinking of you, James, as I was doing this earlier, thinking how you quantify the defensive ability of, well, Oldham players and whether it's harder for League Two than Premier League. But
Yeah. No, you're right. I did think about my very rudimentary attempts with the player elo ratings to get it defensive, but because you're right, I think it's always must be the same across lots of sports that defensive attributes, if you haven't got really extensive event data, are a lot harder to use to evaluate.
Yeah.
More questions and comments? Seems not. So thank you, Alec. That's a really interesting presentation. And wish you all the best as you develop the work further with your co-authors. As mentioned,
Thank you, James.
This is the first leg of a Alex doubleheader. We've got Alex Farnell today, and we'll have Alex Creamer next week from Maynooth University College, and Alex will be presenting trimming of extreme votes and favoritism, evidence from the field. So thanks once again, everyone. Good to see everyone. A great weekend, and look forward to seeing you all again next week.
Thanks, James.
Cheers, Alex.